In 1850, Unitarian minister Theodore Parker in Boston, in a speech at the New England Anti-Slavery Convention, said this: "There is what I call the American idea. I so name it because it seems to me to lie at the basis of all our truly original, distinctive, and American institutions. It is itself a complex idea, composed of three subordinate and more simple ideas, namely," and I'm going to make it gender inclusive, "the idea that all people have unalienable rights, that in respect thereof, all people are created equal, and that government is to be established and sustained for the purpose of giving every person an opportunity for the enjoyment and development of all of these unalienable rights. This idea demands, as the proximate organization thereof, a democracy. That is, a government of all the people, by all the people, and for all the people. Of course, a government after the principles of eternal justice, the unchanging laws of God. For shortness' sake, I will call it the idea of freedom." Now, Abraham Lincoln picked up that phrasing of, by, and for all the people, because he was reading the works of Theodore Parker, which his law partner out in Springfield, Illinois, William Herndon, had sent out to him about 4 times a year. Herndon was a great fan of Parker's. Lincoln shortened Parker's encapsulation of democracy, dropping the alls, and came up with a famous phrase in his Gettysburg Address that then went on to be repeated all over the world as the simple, shortest, most profound definition of democracy. So Parker said most clearly, by democratic process in our congregations and in society at large, one of our principles, is essential to our faith tradition, for it springs from the recognition of the inherent worth and dignity of every human being, another one of our principles. Democratic process takes that universal dignity and makes it real, gives it a process to make itself viable, incarnate. Without democratic process, inherent worth and dignity is just a slogan, some nice words, with no chance of raising up a community to count on, to listen to, and to effectuate that worth and dignity. So democratic process at heart is not a political issue foremost. Rather, it is a spiritual one of faith, one at the heart of our religious tradition. And it leads inevitably to government by all the people, for all the people, of, by, and for. Of course, that's not what we always get, since there are also a lot of people who don't really want such a thing. Some believe in elitism, such as Ayn Rand's followers, etc. The widening wealth gap in this country has exacerbated the distorting influence of money on our political process. We have these huge influential entities that our founders never foresaw in all of their deliberations, these things we call corporations, that amass monetary influence far beyond the means of any individual, and so on. But nevertheless, democracy is central to this country, as well as a central part of our particular faith tradition. So, with that inheritance behind us and all around us, we meet what I, Claire, the regular minister here, Claire Petersberger, and a great number of other people consider to be the greatest moral issue of our time, a challenge such as humanity has never faced in its 5,000 years or so of civilized development, the climate crisis. Of course, we do not all have to agree either on exactly what this means or how we're going to meet it, but I think that we surely need to be researching, to get information, and talking together about what we think our situation is and how we propose to meet it. Let's learn from the bees. There are differences, as there should be among us, even on the Green Sanctuary Committee. For instance, the dangers and promises of fracking, as an example. So I'll only speak for myself, as one worker honeybee scout, bringing back what I've learned, or at least I think I've learned, and hold to be most important. Not looking for a new home somewhere else, of course, like the bees, but looking for a new approach to making our common home sustainable, livable. I look forward to hearing what you've discovered and what you deem important as well. I'll almost bypass all of this, or most of the sobering news about increasingly strong weather fronts and hence storms, more severe droughts and flooding with their effects on farm yields and hence on food scarcity and security, the temporary masking of greenhouse gas effects by the absorption of CO2 into the oceans, temporarily heating them instead of heating us, but unfortunately, at the same time, making them more acidic and thus imperiling the entire life chain and hence food chain in them. The security threats of climate migrations, ethnic and other wars over diminishing or moving resources, the huge public health effects of the spread of tropical diseases, more bug populations per summer, etc., increased asthma and heat-related deaths, and so on. Financial insecurity brought on by disrupted supply lines, budget strains from coping with climate change, increased volatility from new risks. Just look at what the housing collapse, bubble collapse in our country, it almost brought down the entire world economic community. No one saw that coming. The economic community is very sensitive to risk and much more fragile than we had thought. The devastation wrought by increasingly extreme methods of extraction of fossil fuels, like mountaintop removal, deep water drilling, and many would say fracking. The dangers of passing tipping points, such as methane release from Arctic oceans and tundra, which would take all control over what is happening out of our hands, and so on. We're currently headed for a 3 degrees Celsius, and you can kind of double that for Fahrenheit, a 3 degrees Celsius rise by 2100, which is huge. Doesn't sound like a lot, but it's huge. Since what we're already seeing so far, the effects we're already seeing so far, even though masked by the CO2 absorption in the oceans that I talked about, is all from a 0.8 degrees temperature rise since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution to now. 0.8 Industrial Revolution to now, talking 3 by the end of the century. And we're now currently headed toward a 3 to 6 foot, somebody would say more, seafood level, sea level rise by 2100. And I ask you just to think what 3 to 6 feet rise means to downtown Baltimore, let alone the Eastern Shore, or the huge percentage of humanity living by the oceans. It's where we tend to live, and made more extreme by, of course, the flood surges from more extreme weather events. So I said that briefly, I just went through it quickly. But a huge fact that I find only rarely included in our talk about our situation is this. We can only burn up somewhere between a fifth and a third, 20 to 33% or so, of the already known fossil fuel reserves of oil, gas, and coal before we reach the 2 degrees Celsius warming, which all the nations of the earth have agreed upon in Copenhagen as being the upper limit of what we can reasonably bear as humanity without catastrophic consequences. Now and I think that works out to about 450 parts per billion per billion of carbon dioxide. Many of you know that Jim Hansen, a whole other number of scientists from NASA have said that number is way too high. That's why they came up with 350 as the much more realistic number. But I'm going to put that aside for now. We know that the amount of CO2 put up to achieve the 0.8 degree rise so far, and so it's possible to calculate how much more CO2 we can put up before we reach 2 degrees, which the nations have agreed upon. Carbon Tracker did the initial estimates, an extremely prestigious number crunching thing. They got access to a lot of proprietary inside information because of their reputation from coal companies, et cetera, to figure out what their best estimates of what they have. Carbon Tracker did the first, then the International Energy Agency did a second, the World Bank did a third through its former chief financial officer, Lawrence Stern, in the report bearing his name, and now others, hence the range of percentages from 20 to 33 or so. Standard & Poor's has also done a recent one. Mind you, I'm talking about known reserves. I'm not even counting the exploration for new reserves that is still going on apace. And the importance of this fact is that the largest corporations in the history of the planet, in our whole history, the fossil fuel corporations, are currently headed toward a huge collision with the unanimous will of the world's governments and hence, hopefully, its people. The great majority of the financial assets currently underground will have to be abandoned and left there if we are to preserve the planet anywhere near the conditions upon which civilization arose. That huge percentage of gas, oil, and coal in the ground becomes then what are called stranded assets. Assets you got, but you can't use them. And no corporation likes to throw those away, since assets on the books keep share prices high, etc. It's their money in the ground. Based upon their past actions, it's hard to be optimistic about how these huge corporations will react. So far, what they've done in this country is invest billions of dollars in a public disinformation campaign modeled on the tactics of the tobacco industry decades ago, casting doubt on the science, claiming that there's more disagreement among scientists than there actually is, et cetera, et cetera. In fact, they've actually hired the same advertising agencies, public relations experts, and lawyers that the tobacco companies used formerly. It's the same model. Business as usual has been extremely profitable for these companies because, beside the huge tax giveaways and public subsidies that we've granted them, they've not had to pay in any way for the downstream results of the CO2 waste going into the air. Those waste costs are being borne in huge ways by the public, by the peoples of the planet, and will be even more borne by their children and grandchildren. But the increasing risk, realization of the risk of stranded assets, otherwise known as a carbon bubble, like the IT bubble and the housing bubble before, is beginning to have a huge effect. You may have seen recently that the agreement of ExxonMobil to greater transparency in its assessments of the risk of that bubble. That may be good PR or maybe simple benevolence, but it could also be driven by the risk of shareholder class action lawsuits, since any company has a legal responsibility to report to its investors known risks that it knows about. And the tobacco companies, as we all know, got in big trouble when they were found out to have been lying to the public and to their investors for years. Now, of course, I don't know about the motivations, but I do know that right now there is a sea change going on in the financial community based not on climate change morality, but simply on fiduciary responsibility of investment advisors, because they have to tell their clients about risk. The divestment reinvestment movement, modeled on the South African one before it, which will be coming up at our own GA this June, our General Assembly, is a further part of this equation with both moral and economic bases. You can argue it from either end. For we smaller folk that don't have huge financial investments like that, there is a mom and pop corollary. Move our money, protect our planet. However you phrase it, the central moral point is this: it is immoral to profit from the destruction of the planet. It's immoral to profit from the destruction of the planet. Now, of course, there's hope that the fossil fuel corporations steer themselves toward becoming truly energy corporations and investing in renewable energy instead of further domestic extreme fossil-based extraction methods such as currently. And I'm told by people in industry that evidently Ma Bell, for instance, left huge amounts of assets stranded when it went from its old landline technologies to new digitalized and satellite technologies. This happens all the time. Companies have to just abandon all kinds of infrastructure they built up for old technologies as new ones make them obsolete. So it's not impossible. But what does seem clear to me is that this change will happen when we, the people, insist that both these corporations and our government, via its policies, place the good of all the people ahead of the good of some of the people. This is where democracy counts, and this is where all of us come in. This is our future. This is the future of our children and grandchildren, and it is the future of the most poor and vulnerable upon the planet. And it is the future of the other species as well. You may have heard about the recent historical study commissioned by NASA, which looked at the effects of environmental unsustainable practices and resulting degradation on the downfall of a number of historic empires. And the historical pattern from Mesopotamia on is very clear all over the earth. Overreach for wealth and the resulting passing of sustainable environmental limits, together with a concomitant widening of the economic gap between elites and the commoners, so that the elites, protected for a while by their great resources, semi-obliviously continue with business as usual, while commoners and the environmental systems go down the tubes until the elites inevitably follow. And that's how civilization after civilization has been found to end. Economic disparity growing, environmental degradation way past sustainability. So we, my friends, have to be democratically smarter today than those old empires. There is no reason that we cannot be given full, vigorous, sustained democratic participation like the honeybees use. Study after study reveals we already have the needed technologies and science, though of course a more level energy field will spur major innovation. What we lack is not the technology and the science. What we lack is will for public policy of, by, and for all the people. Take one very hopeful development in our political sphere. I, like many others, have pretty much given up on Congress, given the huge contributions of fossil fuel corporations to the members there, and exacerbated by the results of this huge disinformation campaign. So it's even hard to get Congress people to talk about. Well, that's not quite true of it. But after the demise of cap and trade several years ago, there is now a real possibility of a simple fee and dividend approach that even passes the Grover-Norquist test of no new monies for government, okay, that a lot of members have taken. This fee and dividend proposal is backed by Jim Hansen, our foremost climate scientist, the Climate Citizens Lobby, and a whole host of other people, and is drawing real interest privately from conservative Congress people. And I have to note here that our own Montgomery County Congressperson, Chris Van Hollen, who's long been invested in fee and dividend ideas in Senate, is working on a House version of the Senate bill. And the reason this is drawing real interest among more conservative members of Congress is this. It puts a price on carbon, a fee, at the point of extraction. And then it lets the market work out what happens from there on as the increased price of energy trickles down to everybody. So it's very simple. The market takes care of all this. You don't have to write legislation. But then the fee that has been collected is distributed evenly amongst all U.S. citizens. Nothing goes to the government. It goes straight back to all of us. So that about 3/4 of us actually come out even or even a little bit ahead in our ability to pay for energy. Whereas the real gas guzzlers, etc., or the squanderers, pay much more steeply, as they should. But what that then does is that gets everybody starting to think about conservation, starting to think about energy efficiency, etc. All those market things start to apply, and we start moving in the right direction. The whole program is introduced gradually, so as not to cause an instant shock to the economy. And every serious analyst of our climate situation says we simply have to have a fee on carbon. And this does it equitably and simply. So in conclusion, my friends, as the head of our United Nations Office Climate Change Task Force, Jan Dash, who is an economic risk management professor, puts it in 10 words regarding climate change. It's real, it's now, scientists agree, it's bad, and there's hope. But the hope does not reside out there in technological fixes. It resides in us here, in our making full use of the magnificent democratic heritage that has been placed in our laps by our religious forebears and others, a veneration of government of, by, and for all the people. We are the ones who must make this promise real. Time makes this issue urgent, for inaction only worsens things for those coming after. We are the elders, we are the citizens, we are the Unitarian Universalists who must make Theodore Parker proud and enable ourselves to look into the eyes of our children and grandchildren. We're going to close with song number 1064, Move Over.